With me today is David Hart, the retiring General Secretary of the National Association of Head Teachers, where he's worked for 27 years. David is as well known as a spokesman on television as he is amongst his head teacher members. Now, I don't know whether you ever go berserk privately, David, but to me you've always seemed completely unflappable.
Well, I like to think I am. After all, we have to juggle so many balls in the air, frankly, dealing with any government's agenda I can think of. But if you don't actually try and maintain some semblance of sanity, you really would go under. So, yes, I think I am unflappable, but privately I certainly do sometimes wonder what the hell we're up to.
Because you started as a lawyer, didn't you? I mean, you came in not as a head teacher, but as a lawyer, which was a bit unusual. I suppose people normally assume a head teacher leader will be a head teacher. Well,
I think it's unique, actually. And, of course, I used to advise the NAHT when I was a lawyer in private practice. So when the job came up, I decided to go for it, and they appointed me, not because I think they wanted somebody who actually ran a school, but somebody who actually knew what the problems were, could advise in terms of government programmes, government initiatives in Parliament.
Well, one of your colleagues said that your greatest achievement is that you've put the NAHT on the map, that when you first arrived back in 1978, the fag end of the Callaghan government with a majority of 4, it was a small, insignificant union, and now it's quite significant. So what were those early days like when you first came in, late 70s?
Well, we only represented head teachers. We didn't have deputies or assistant heads in membership. We had, as you say, a fag end of a government. So in that sense, I was struck with the fact that the government really was neutered. It had nowhere to go. It didn't have a programme, but it could say it was an education legislation programme. So we actually had to build up the role of heads. And of course, the first big challenge was the winter of discontent. The schools were being threatened with strike action, and the caretakers were certainly pretty militant, and understandably so. And we were called in by then Secretary of State Shirley Williams and her permanent secretary, and she said to me, David, she said, will the heads keep the schools open? I said, no, they won't keep the schools open. It's not their job to keep the schools open. And within a short period of time, of course, the government collapsed. I don't think it was because of what I said.
I suspect the grave diggers may have had a bit to do with it.
Indeed, and everybody else, the road sweepers and everybody collecting the rubbish as well. So the whole thing collapsed, the government, really. But there's no doubt about it that not keeping the schools open was a significant issue.
And then, of course, things changed because 1979, you had Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister. Was that a big shock to the system?
It was a hell of a shock to the system, of course, but Margaret really wasn't that interested in education. She really left that to other people to deliver. She was more interested in international affairs. But, of course, during her period of office, we did have major change, and I think probably Ken Baker was the Secretary of State who really brought about the biggest change. You know, we got responsibility for our budgets. We had a change in the national curriculum. You know, James Callaghan had said the curriculum is a secret garden. We must get into it. Teachers mustn't control it. So that was developed by Thatcher and her ministers. And obviously, they gave a lot more power to heads. And of course, they introduced the grant-maintain movement, which was a shock to the system as well.
Now, moving ahead, of course, later, much later, you found yourself with a Labour government. Did you find many differences between Tony Blair, head of a large majority government, Margaret Thatcher, head of a strong government in the early 80s?
Oh, a fundamental difference, because Blair said and meant it, education, education, education. But whereas Margaret Thatcher had a big majority and did bring about change, when Tony Blair came in, he took the view, and he was quite right, that standards were not high enough. Now, the way they developed that was through David Blunkett, who I think was a profoundly important Secretary of State.
In what respect?
Well, because I think he drove through the literacy and numeracy strategies, for instance, which have had a major impact on primary schools and are now impacting on secondary schools at Key Stage 3, 11 to 14. He also, of course, revolutionised teachers' pay. You know, the £30,000 classroom teacher was the phrase he coined, and he delivered it, albeit I think he perhaps pulled the wool over the Treasury's eyes. They thought they were getting a rigorous performance-related pay system. They weren't at all. But anyway...
97% of people who applied went through. Yes.
Indeed, and more are now moving up the pay scale. But I think teachers have done quite well under the Labour government in terms of pay and conditions of service. My worry, of course, is independence and autonomy, but do it my way. There's still that sort of feeling about the government, but it wants to control matters.
Now, you mentioned head teachers' changing role, and now they've got responsibility for budgets and all sorts of things they didn't have when you first started. I mean, do you think the pendulum has swung too far now, that head teachers are really being buried under responsibilities and to some extent aren't able to do what they were able to do in the late 70s, early 80s when you started?
I think the pendulum has swung too far, but I think there's a genuine optimism that we might be beginning to see a change at government policy so that we are going to see perhaps the genuine independence and autonomy that I think we ought to have. The irony is, of course, is we used to control the curriculum, now we don't. We used to have no say worth talking about in staffing or indeed in budgets, now we do.
The way this plays out, of course, and many of your members are primary heads and have a tremendous, I mean, they have to shoulder almost everything, and many now complain they can't do things they used to like doing, like, for example, teaching themselves, getting into classrooms. I mean, these are things that they feel they miss because of all the administration they've got.
Well, the buzzword, and quite rightly, is the prime responsibility of head teachers is to do the teaching and the learning, or be responsible for the teaching and the learning. That is the number one issue. Now, to do that, they clearly have to have not only the expertise, but they clearly also have to have the time to manage and to lead, to ensure that the standards in the classrooms are the requisite standard and that they improve those standards in the classroom.
Well, here's an interesting thing, because the style of leadership seems to me to have changed, maybe had to change, during your period of office, certainly, and particularly in the last few years. I mean, people now talk about distributed leadership, and even brand new teachers are being told you're a manager. That's right. Here you are, you've got resources, you've got children, you've got time and space to manage, so it's not just the head.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's just simply another way of saying you have to operate as a team, and you're all members of that team, and if you're a classroom teacher, you are still managing your classroom, you're managing the pupils, you're managing the environment. Of course, as you take greater responsibility, coordination, responsibility for a key stage, responsibility for special educational needs pupils, you undertake more responsibility, you're more senior members of a team, if you like that term. But it is a team approach, and if you can't work as a team, led by the head teacher, then I think the school is liable to fail, quite frankly.
Head teacher as autocrat has gone, do you think?
Oh,
or have
yes.
you got one or two members still around, a few little dinosaurs hidden here and there?
Oh, there's bound to be a few dinosaurs in a system with 23,000 schools, but no, I think the vast majority of heads, frankly, are team leaders. They can't work without that concept.
Well, just looking back a few years again to the early 90s, there was this massive growth in accountability, wasn't there? And then, of course, Ofsted replaced HMI after their 153 years of existence. Can you think back to that moment when Ofsted came in and what your reaction was and how things turned out?
Yeah, I can. The then senior chief inspector was a redoubtable woman called Sheila Brown. She was horrified, of course, at the idea that HMI would be replaced by Ofsted, but the Secretary of State in those days was Ken Clarke. He was determined to bring Ofsted in. And, of course, we had a chief inspector called Chris Woodhead, who immediately...
I'd forgotten about him.
Yeah, I thought you might have done. But, I mean, basically speaking, Chris Woodhead immediately set the cat amongst the pigeons, umpteen thousand incompetent teachers. That was a great headline, of course. And things went down...
Did you ever have a free and frank exchange of views with him?
Oh, plenty. I must say, my initial impression of Chris Woodhead was really quite positive, because I think actually he was a breath of fresh air, but I think he went downhill quite seriously, quite quickly, because he was on a crusade. And the messages he gave to the teaching profession were on the whole negative.
Are you able to disclose now, with the passage of time, some of the things that you actually said to him?
Well, I said to him that he was demoralising the teaching profession, but for all the good he was doing, in the sense he was trying to concentrate on good teaching practice and so on and so forth, he was also at the same time giving the message to the public, to parents and to politicians, that there were far too many lazy, incompetent teachers out there, and they needed sorting out. The reality was that there were a small number of teachers who were not up to scratch, and they needed support, encouragement, and then if that didn't work, yes, okay, one had to get them out of the profession, but that wasn't the way he wanted to do it.
But then Tony Blair not only kept him on, but gave him a whacking pay rise, which I suppose must have led to you and a fair number of your colleagues choking over your cornflakes.
I have to say, I think it was one of Tony Blair's few mistakes he's made in relation to education when he said he'd keep the chief inspector on. He should never have done that. Anybody could have told him. That might have been good politics in terms of certain members of the media. It wasn't good for the teaching profession. And of course, soon they ruled the day they kept him on, because he was a thorn in their flesh and we had to get rid of him eventually.
Now, bringing Ofsted up to date, David Bell will proudly tell us that it's all changing, and changing for the better. And, he's very keen on getting better relationships with people like your members. Do you think the new style Ofsted is on the right lines?
Yes, it is, but we must make sure that we don't keep loading Ofsted with more and more responsibilities. So they're in for a short period of time, and suddenly, oh gosh, they've got to that they've got to report on the quality of the school meals.
I mean, do you think self-evaluation is actually working? It's a nice idea, I'm in favour of it, but is it working in the form it's in when it's bureaucratic?
It'll only work, quite frankly, if it leads to genuine reduction in bureaucracy and red tape. Self-evaluation should be positive, it should involve the parents, should involve the pupils, should involve the governor, should involve the community. Pull that all together and we have a rounded picture of what the school's actually like, weaknesses and strengths. And that could be a professional dialogue, and should be a professional dialogue with this school improvement partner every year.
What about the specific issue of discipline? Because there's a lot of talk nowadays about whether it's harder for schools, and of course that's falling very much on head teachers. What do you think your members are thinking about this?
They definitely think indiscipline is on the increase. Now, I don't mean necessarily the high-profile incident, the terrible tragedies, the knife, the gun, or whatever it may be we've had over the past decade or more. I'm talking more about the lower-level disruption, which pupils frankly can perpetrate and can damage the education of their fellow pupils quite seriously. That is on the increase, and it's not just in the more deprived areas, it's right across the country. And teachers and head teachers report that quite regularly.
I mean, I've got now many examples of head teachers I've spoken to who have been told to F off by some of their pupils. That's a sort of minimum badge of honour in some cases, which is very difficult if you think of the authority role that a head teacher is supposed to play, and yet people do this in some cases.
Well, absolutely, the language is getting worse, and people tend to sort of throw all the blame at parents and the family background and forget. But a lot of these youngsters, top end of primary school, bottom end of secondary school, are switched off sometimes, either by the teaching or by the curriculum. That's really why we have got to get a curriculum, particularly for the 14 to 16-year-olds, which is where most of the trouble can be, which is relevant to their needs. That's why the Tomlinson report, for instance, is such a fundamentally important document.
Now, there's been a fair amount of tension between the government, including the Prime Minister himself, and head teachers over the years. In March, the head teachers of another body, whose name we will not mention, but was not your own union, gave a rather rough ride to Ruth Kelly as Secretary of State. What was your reaction to that? Because they didn't exactly boo her, but they weren't exactly the best behaved class in town.
Well, I personally feel quite strongly if you invite a Secretary of State or anybody as your guest to a conference, you treat them respectfully. You do have a vigorous exchange. Okay, that's fine.
Did you understand that they felt she was talking twaddle, so they reacted negatively, or do you think that was a bit
Well, I
naughty?
think the speech was extremely misguided, and she should never, quite honestly, have said to them that they didn't know, or imply they didn't know how to deal with parents. That was the number one mistake. The number two mistake was to write off Tomlinson in one sentence. Basically, we have our view, you have your view, and we'll agree to differ.
But that was a crucial time in our education history, I think, and possibly a defining moment, because here was a high-profile and high-prestige group with a highly respected chair, spends 2 years, consults your members, industry, employers, everybody else, comes up with something that, on the whole, your membership, despite reservations, was behind, and suddenly it's out. I mean, is that a style of government that you find, I was going to say rather challenging in a way, because it's a bit like naughty children, isn't it?
Well, I think it was disgraceful, quite frankly, and I honestly think the government has got it wrong. Not got it wrong in every respect. There are aspects of their response which I totally support. But really, we had consensus. We had the universities. We had business. We had everybody you can think of on side, with some reservations, okay. And the government suddenly turns around and says, sorry, no can do. We'll review the whole situation in 2008, way after the next election.
Now, if you're feeling strong, I'll offer you 2 words: workforce and agreement. Gone a bit pear-shaped, hasn't it, really? Because here you were as a union, head teachers, apparently behind it, then suddenly they turn it down. And you yourself had put your own shoulder behind it. So did you feel betrayed? Did you feel it was the wrong move?
Well, certainly the wrong move, and I made my position very clear, but having made that decision, I will respect it and I will support it as best I can in terms of representation to government. I mean, the reality, of course, is this, that the government has tried to lever in appropriate funding. At national level, just about adequate, okay. But of course, when it gets down to local authority, down to schools, you get a different picture. And the reality is that at school level, in a number of local authorities, including a lot in the southwest, I should add, they don't think they've got the cash to deliver these reforms.
And one-to-one tuition and other things?
Indeed, and what I think the government's got to understand is instead of wagging their finger, head teachers, and saying, you will deliver, and if you don't, there'll be industrial action or tribunals all over the place, they need to be more understanding and say, look, we understand that there will be a number of heads in this country who are going to be in difficulty, of that there's no doubt.
Now, Ruth Kelly has actually used the term smokescreen about the funding and financing of various things, like the workforce agreement and others. What do you think is the truth behind that?
The truth is that it's a funding problem, and what I think she's trying to argue is that it's nothing to do with money, it's about head teachers unwilling to introduce government policy or government reform. So in other words, if they don't want to do it. I think it's extremely unfair. There is not a single head I've ever come across in the last few years who has denied the importance of delivering guaranteed non-contact time, we used to call it, for teachers and indeed for their own senior members of staff. So it's not a question of the agenda, it's a question of whether the money's there.
But this is a consequence of what you've experienced in your own history, where Kenneth Baker gave schools more freedom, gave head teachers the control over their budgets. Now it means governments now and in future can turn around and say, well, you've got the money, you can do it.
Yeah, well, they might try and get away with that argument, but reality, of course, is far more complex, as you know.
So have you actually been able to do anything to try and get the additional funding or the necessary funding? I mean, what have you actually done?
We've done a hell of a lot on behalf of our members. We worked weekly almost over the past 2 or 3 years.
With any success?
Yes, with great success. I mean, we've achieved not a bad settlement for last year. We've achieved, I think, a good settlement for next year. And we've actually got more cash into local authorities, more cash into school budgets than our members actually thought they would get. But they still don't think it's enough in some cases, and that's why we have this controversy.
Is this going to be a huge headache for your successor? Because your successor comes in after your sterling work for 20-odd years and suddenly finds union against union and major problems of that kind.
Well, it will be one hell of a challenge for that person, but I think the crucial point is this. Any government that thinks it can ignore people who represent getting on for 30,000 school leaders is, I think, making a big mistake. Because at some stage, you've actually got to keep touching base with people who represent the senior members of a profession, if you like to use that term, who are going to deliver the government policies. The government cannot deliver workforce reform. It can't change the pay structure this year. It can't get its childcare policy home and dry. It can't get extended schooling without the support of head teachers.
In some ways, it's now the end of an era. I mean, you're leaving. The other unions, people like Doug McAvoy, NUT, Nigel de Grucci, long-serving, and then also, of course, there's Peter Smith, ATL. So you've had big changes in the leadership of the unions. What's going to happen next?
Well, I think what's going to happen is the unions have got to perhaps have a clear view about what their role is. This government has become experts at developing what they call the social partnership. In other words, the workforce agreement or the new pay structure. So they've become very adept at bringing into play a group of unions and employers and sitting them down and saying, we are a social partnership, we will work this out together. And everybody has to sign up and everybody has to keep agreeing. Now, that's fine. That's fine until, like in the workforce agreement, until somebody says, sorry, but we don't think it's working.
But you don't have the power now, do you? See, because when you first came in, when you started your career, the unions are all powerful. Do you think there's no way back now, that unions are going to be rather impotent, if one's honest about it?
No, not impotent, but they simply have to understand that there's a different way by which they bring influence to bear. So we can bring influence to bear in the social partnership, we can bring influence to bear in the separate negotiations, consultations you have with government because you represent school leaders. But the days of being able to, through industrial action, for instance, or that sort of muscle, influence government are, I think, few and far between. And that is why, of course, I've said to NAHT members very clearly that you have to understand that there are limitations to saying no, and that doesn't necessarily bring governments to the negotiating table.
But would you want to see all the unions working together closely, or would you even want to go further and say all the unions should merge, or all the teacher unions should merge, and the head teacher unions should merge, or there should just be a single union representing the whole teaching profession. Will that day come? Would you want it?
I've always argued for two, one representing classroom teachers and one representing school leaders, because I think actually their interests can be extremely different. So two unions, I think the merger of the three biggest will come, not yet, but it will come about in due time.
As you look back over the years and these different people you've worked with in different events in education, what are the big high points for you, the moments when you felt maybe that you'd achieved something, or that the profession had moved substantially forward, or that here was an important date in our educational history?
Well, I think under Thatcher, I think that the Education Reform Act was a major change, and I think the passing of the Education Reform Act, and we did an enormous amount of lobbying, had quite an influence on that particular bill. I think
the pluses outweigh the minuses?
Oh yes, I think there's no doubt about it at all. I mean, clearly there's some pretty awful points. I can well remember John Patten's speech to an annual conference we had in Newcastle.
I remember it well, I was there.
Good. Well, and the reception he had was far worse than the reception Ruth Kelly got the other day. So, I mean, that was a low point, not from our association's point of view, but it was the Secretary of State who was totally out of sync with anything that was being felt by the members of the teaching profession. Low points, I think, apart from John Patten, I think the way in which Margaret Thatcher got rid of ministers who didn't actually happen to sign up to her particular credo. I mean,
names, please.
Well, Mark Carlyle was too wet. John McGregor went native and got too friendly with the teachers' organisations. Ken Clarke was hardly in there long enough to make any difference. He didn't want Education Secretary, quite frankly, and he made it very clear he didn't want the job.
You're almost sounding as if you're president of the Kenneth Baker fan club.
Well, no, I know. I mean, I think Keith Joseph was a profoundly important Secretary of State. The trouble is with Keith, he's never had the money. So he talked about the bottom 40%, not a very happy expression, but that was his way of talking about them. And he had a real empathy for the bottom 40%. But when you said, well, where's the money, Keith? He used to say, well, sorry, but it was not there.
I'm a monetarist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we ended up with John Major as Prime Minister, and the whole thing really went pear-shaped there because he couldn't make his mind up. I can well remember those of us who were in the grant-maintained sort of world, in the sense that we had a lot of grant-maintained members, of course. I can well remember people saying, look, why the hell do we have to have these parental ballots? What have they got to do with it? Why don't we actually simply say all secondary schools will go grant-maintained, or all primary schools? But John Major couldn't bring himself to make that sort of decision, and then, of course, he left.
And I was going to say you've seen off, but you've worked with, or against sometimes, 4 different Prime Ministers, 12 different Secretaries of State. What do you think you've managed to achieve personally?
Well, I think raise the profile of headship and school leadership now. We've got a wider number of school leaders in the NAHT. I think we've certainly improved the pay of our members, which I think is important. I think our members have raised standards. I'd like to think I've contributed to that. There's no doubt about it, but although standards may not be high enough, we are doing, by any stretch of imagination, a good job in the vast majority of schools. And I think we have a cohort of school leaders who can do the business, providing they're given the support, given the resources, given the independence and autonomy, but accountability that goes with it, that they deserve.
Any regrets as you look back? Are there moments where you feel if only you'd done this, or if only you'd done that? Or things you'd like to have done but never got the opportunity, or didn't get the support, or whatever?
Yes, I mean, I think probably the biggest regret I have is that we've not been able to turn the government round on league tables or on aspects of the testing system. But no, I mean, league tables are a long-running sore. And as long as government believes that parents like league tables or the press like league tables, government believes we must rule by targets. Well, I think they've understood now that targets can be a two-edged sword so far as politicians are concerned. We're going to have that running sore. So my great regret, really, I think, is that we've not been able to respond to our members' genuine concerns about aspects of the accountability agenda they don't like.
Now, just between ourselves, and I promise not to tell anyone your answer, but of the Prime Ministers and Secretaries of States you've worked with, I mean, come on, quick, let down hair time. Who are the best and worst?
Best Prime Minister must be Tony Blair, because I think because I think Tony Blair has had a genuine feel for education. Not made every decision right by any means.
You don't mind all this kind of stranglehold from his number 10 unit, you'll live with that?
Oh, I can live with the number 10 unit because I think that the number 10 unit has to live with the Secretary of State. I mean, number 10 cannot, at the end of the day, control how the education system works. They have good ideas, they have not such good ideas, and one can have a dialogue with number 10 and have a dialogue with the Secretary of State of the day. And I still believe that Tony Blair has his heart in the right place, and I think that actually he has moved the education service on. Not always correctly, but on the whole, I think he's the best of the Prime Ministers I've had to deal with.
The Secretary of State?
I think, in terms of impact, I think the two, and I put them at the top, I think Ken Baker and David Blunkett. I think...
That's fair-minded, 1-1.
1-1, and it could have been Charles Clarke if he had stayed long enough. Because although Charles had a reputation as being something of a bruiser, the reality was he's a big politician. And you need a big politician in that department because you've got the Treasury, you've got John Prescott, and you've got the Prime Minister. And they all think that they have a big stake in how the education system of the future will roll out.
Now, you've been very polite and talked about the best, but who gets the David Hart Complete Pits Prize?
John Patten.
He walks off with it, does he?
He walks off by a significant margin, in my view. A totally and utterly disastrous Secretary of State, who actually didn't run the department at all. It was run by Baroness Blatch, his Minister of State. She did all the talking. He has sat there and said nothing. And
are you optimistic about the future? I mean, do you see the 21st century as a time when things can build and improve, or as a time when things will stand still or get worse?
Oh, I think I am optimistic. I think I'm optimistic because I actually think we have a damn good cohort of school leaders in the business of running schools, getting the teaching and learning right. I have an enormous respect for them. They have tremendous responsibility, too much sometimes, too much accountability. All the ills of society are thrown upon them, and I think we just need to understand that there's a limit to the amount we can expect of them. And of course, we do need to look after their workload and look after their work-life balance.
And then finally, when the day comes when you eventually hang up your boots for the last time, or in your case, hang up your last quote, what are you going to be doing after that? You're too young to know, so what are you going to do?
Ride horses. It's my passion. I don't get enough of time on my horse.
Will you go anywhere near education? Will you go anywhere near a head teacher?
Yeah.
If you see a head teacher, will you run in the opposite direction?
No. I'm being
friend?
offered consultancies by certain people that I'm talking to, so I shall keep my hand in, but I think at some stage you ought to call it a day and say, well, perhaps somebody younger ought to take that challenge on.
Well, David Hart, thank you very much indeed, and all the best for the future.
Thank you.